have it on the streets of every major city in this country. And you know who's feeding and supporting the enemy? The casual drug user. That's who. That's who. And so I just believe that it's time we got serious and we show exactly how we feel about these people who aid and support the enemy of the United States of America and the people of the United States of America, the kids of America. I think we need to show that in some demonstrable way, and that's what I'm trying to do. I also think we need to say to the people in the Andean nations, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, men and women who are being killed every single day, shedding their blood for the people of the United States, keeping it out of the coke out of the United States of America. We need to tell them, hey, we're not hypocrites. We're not hypocrites. We're going to condemn those people who casually use drugs in this nation. And we're going to condemn them in the worst way.
When I first heard about the Watts riots, I was told it was based on a lie. Some upstanding police officers had pulled over a criminal. That criminal's mother got involved, not wanting the family's only car to be towed, and started fighting with the cops. Someone in the crowd reported that one of the officers had kicked the mother and she was pregnant, and what followed was one of the largest riots in U.S. history. All because someone in the crowd made up a story. A real-life boy who cried wolf. 34 dead. $40 million in property damage. What a tragedy. So it would seem. The reality, however, was much more gray. On Christmas Eve 1951, 2 LAPD officers responded to a call about underage drinking in a bar. The patrons gave their IDs and were found to be of age, but, being Latino, they were still asked to leave. Understandably, they refused as they weren't doing anything wrong and the bar owner was in error. The officers demanded that they leave anyway, and a fight broke out that left one of the cops missing an eye. The men went home to sleep off their buzz, only to have their houses violently raided 7 hours later, then being dragged to a nearby park to be savagely beaten before being booked into jail. At the jail, 50 officers returning to duty drunk after a Christmas party removed the men from their cells and beat them once more for at least 95 minutes. Then continued years of residential segregation and blockbusting. In 1948, the courts ruled the practice illegal in Shelley v. Kramer, and by 1964, with the Civil Rights Act, black and brown Americans would receive the lawful equality they deserved. But culture would take many years to develop. And that same year, California would pass Proposition 14, allowing landlords to openly discriminate against potential clients based on ethnicity. Even in my state of Arizona, residential segregation would be utilized as a tactic until as late as 1979. And by the summer of 1965, the population in South Central LA was a powder keg. And the real lie that started the Watts riots was the one told to black Americans when they were promised equality. 200 years earlier, in 1765, the British would pass the Stamp Act. And just 10 years later, in 1775, civil unrest would lead to a war that killed more than 34,000 people. The American abolitionists and revolutionaries are seen as heroes, but the equally oppressed citizens of Chicago, Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta are seen as mere troublemakers. It's difficult to distinguish the two when you truly believe that freedom is for everyone. In 1978, this legacy would be inherited by the new chief of the LAPD, Daryl F. Gates.
Mike Dwyer, we're up here celebrating one of the best chiefs we ever had on the PD celebration. Daryl was there with all of us. He was out there on the streets, Baker to Vegas runs, wherever we needed to be. And we knew who he was, and he was there for us. And that made him the best.
There are a lot of things you can say nice about Daryl Gates. He was just an A1 person, but I think he was probably the most conservative chief, fiscally conservative chief that I ever worked for there.
In Highland Park, where he was raised, we went to Franklin High School. I was about 7, 8 years old when he used to take me and his brother and a couple of friends to the beach. And
I have known him for the past half century and even more than that. And I've known him in every respect, as a partner, as a competitor, and everywhere else. And he is one of the most one of the nicest guys, one of the kindest guy, and he is tough. He's got everything going for him, and I love him like a brother.
I'm proud to say that Chief Gates was my boss for 14 of my 26 years, and probably the greatest chief in the history of this city and perhaps the country. And if we judge him by his enemies, I won't name them, but I'd be proud to have the same enemies he had. Thanks.
I agree.
Gates had a troubled childhood growing up in the desperation of the Great Depression. One would think this would give him insight into the societal results of poverty. His father was an alcoholic and commonly ran afoul of the law, causing him to be bullied by his classmates, and Gates himself would punch an officer during a traffic stop when his brother had been roughed up at the age of 16. In the future, under the yoke of his own police force, this would have landed him with federal charges and imprisonment. But Gates was allowed to simply apologize, and the charges were dropped. After serving a tour of duty in the U.S. Navy during World War II, Gates would enlist in the LAPD in 1949, becoming the driver for then Police Chief William H. Parker, who would preside over the previously mentioned Bloody Christmas of 1951 and the Watts Riots. He was also the man who coined the term Thin Blue Line, and this ideology would be passed down to his driver, who would ultimately be named chief 12 years after Parker's death. Headquarters for the department would be named Parker Center in honor of his legacy. Much like his military service, Daryl Gates accomplished much in his time at the LAPD. Before becoming captain, he worked on such high-profile cases as the Manson family murder of Sharon Tate, the Hillside Strangler, and the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. During his tenure, he would found DARE, or Drug Abuse Resistance Education, a worldwide anti-drug organization that would later find questions about its effectiveness, though these criticisms would be dismissed as propaganda by Gates himself as, quote, to support various individual personal agendas at the expense of children. Which is ironic, as the program repeatedly sought to turn children into informants against the parents and created a generational boomerang effect or reactance, ergo unintended consequences of an attempt to persuade, resulting in the adoption of an opposing position instead. Kids effectively learned about drugs, but whether or not they learned not to use them is debatable. In 1979, he created Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, or CRASH, to combat rising gang crime in LA. Gates had no love for end users of drugs, commenting that, quote, they ought to be taken out and shot. Interestingly, Gates was also responsible for Special Order 40, which stops police from asking immigration status when a suspect is pulled over or questioned. This was done to aid his officers in gathering information from predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods.
This was a mixed group, black, white, and Hispanic. And they came to Los Angeles Police Headquarters in downtown Los Angeles from all over Southern California with a single message for Police Chief Daryl Gates.
His time has ended. He's a liability to the health, the welfare, and the image of the city of Los Angeles. And people from all over the city are here expressing that very sentiment.
Much like his mentor, William Parker, and the Watts riots, Daryl Gates would famously preside over the Rodney King beatings and the subsequent LA riots of 1992. Mr. King would be driving under the influence and be pulled over. Being on probation, he became combative with the police, and what followed was one of the most egregious instances of police brutality ever to be caught on film. Gates said of the incident, I stared at the screen in disbelief. I played the 1-minute 50-second tape again, then again, and again, until I had viewed it 25 times. And still I could not believe what I was looking at. To see my officers engage in what appeared to be excessive use of force, possibly criminally excessive, to see them beat a man with their batons 56 times, to see a sergeant on the scene who did nothing to seize control, was something I never dreamed I would witness.
broad-based question. I know you still take this very personally because you still call the officers your officers. The LAPD is taking broadside shots daily, almost daily. You've got Mark Furman. He's being called a racist rogue cop who never should have been hired by the LAPD. The crime lab is being accused of sloppy work, out of control. The public is left with the image that things at the LAPD are just totally screwed up. And, Chief, there are a lot of people who want to ask you, why and how did things get to be so bad?
Well, I don't think things are bad at all. I think we've got one individual who held thoughts that no one knew about. As a matter of fact, I think it says a great deal about the discipline in the Los Angeles Police Department, because I've talked to a lot of people. I didn't know Mark Furman when he was on the job. I've talked to a lot of people who knew him intimately, who worked in radio cars with him, who played baseball with him, who drank beer with him off duty, and they're shocked. They said, that's not the Mark Furman we knew at all. So I think it shows that while he held these thoughts, and they're terrible, terrible thoughts, there's no indication that he used any of this while he was on the job.
Whether or not Gates endorsed the actions of the 4 officers, the 63 people killed, 2,383 injured, the 12,000 arrests, and over $1 billion in property damage fell on his shoulders and became the summation of his leadership at the LAPD. Gates would resign soon after. The question is, who in their right mind would go from the friendly mustached chip officer Jim Walls to such a polarizing figure? That man was Sierra co-founder Ken Williams. In the beginning, Ken and Roberta Williams were well known for being hot tub-loving, hallucinogenic-taking hippies with a penchant for orgies at their extravagant parties. To work at Sierra in the late 80s and early 90s was to party, and this free-loving attitude would add an inappropriate charm to their earlier games. By the 90s, Ken and Roberta were superstars of the gaming world, and at the helm of a burgeoning business responsible for the livelihoods of hundreds of people, and an aging Ken would become much more straight-laced than he had ever been in his 20s. Josh Mandel, who started with the company in 1990, said of Ken's decision, he kept coming back to Daryl Gates. He seemed to think that was just a golden opportunity he couldn't pass up. Of course, the other staff at Sierra warned about the impending controversy Gates' name would bring. Williams saw only opportunity. Mandel continued, he thought he would get a lot of press and publicity for the game. I thought, it's one thing to seek controversy, but it's another thing to really divide people. To this criticism, Ken Williams simply replied, our players don't read the New York Times. Gates was just as green as Jim Walls in the gaming industry, calling them those eye-hand coordination games, but expressed a desire to try and give people a better appreciation for what officers face on the job and encourage a willingness to support them, which is patently ridiculous considering the subject matter of Police Quest 4 and SWAT, and even internally the former would be referred to as Rodney King's Quest.
Hello and welcome to Police Quest SWAT 2. I'm Daryl Gates, retired chief of the Los Angeles Police Department.
Whether intentional or not, the decision to move away from a fictional town and tether the series to the LAPD would also make it part of the department's legacy. Gone are the endearing sprites we know and love, replaced by a gritty cityscape filled with danger and filth. Just like in Police Quest 1, we get a rare look into the psyche of a police officer, but unlike the plucky cops and robbers, black and white inner thoughts of Jim Walls, we get a picture that is instead full of grit and hostility. Detective Carey isn't the square-jawed hero Sonny Bonds was. He pushes women out of his way, intimidates witnesses, and speaks in a pulpy, crass manner. Who needs procedure and rules when you've got your gut, a can of hairspray, and a lighter? And following proper police procedure, we're then going to use the lighter and the hairspray, and we are going to set the suspect on fire causing third-degree burns
Your action
and
neutralizes
eventual
your assailant.
death by immolation. Of course, it's debatable how much of the story was penned or even looked at by Gates himself, as the writing was done by America's Most Wanted contributor, Tammy Dargan. Dargan received quite a bit of backlash over the stereotypical and sometimes eye-roll-inducing dialogue, then positing the defense that she was simply emulating common parlance of the day. Putting that aside, the story itself isn't particularly good or engaging, and the entire thing falls apart after Act 2, never really providing enough clues to make the reveal satisfying. I like to think that Carrie was killed by the antagonist, and the rather idiotic ending is the final fever dream of his mind as he slips away from this reality. Like the game itself, the ending is a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit, and fans then and now would have much preferred a new outing as Sonny Bonds.
Yes, I'm Mr. Devon. I've been living across from the lawns for the last 10 years. When I first moved in, they were real nice. Showed me and my wife the neighborhood. Yeah, hadn't been the same in the last few years. You know the wife, Lucy? She beats that old man real bad, all day long. You cops been out here. I'm getting to know you guys on a first-name basis.
Some would call SWAT 1 the next entry into the series, when in reality it is simply an LAPD web-based training module that was made available to the public. It's hard to even call it a game at all, but in spite of that, I find myself having a lot of fun training as the SWAT pup and learning about SWAT. Releasing in 1995, by the year 2000, it had sold over 1 million copies. This was the game, still boxed up, sitting on the shelf that kids pulled down one day because they were bored, and it was the only thing that they hadn't played. It's a mystery how this game ended up under so many Christmas trees, but if you had a PC in the 90s, there was a good chance SWAT was within reach. It is a hyper-specific, unforgiving trial-and-error gameplay, but for a fan of FMV games, it is a revelation to behold. Some of the best early mocap is on display here, and what SWAT lacked in function, it made up for in polish. With today's technology, a viewer might sneer, but at the time, many of us lived through the frustration just to unlock one more cutscene. Returning to the writer's room and picking up the lead role of designer was Tammy Dargan. Unabashed by the criticisms of Police Quest 4, she would again write some of the most stereotypical lines in gaming history that are, while somewhat offensive, apt to put one into hysterics as well, if only for their ridiculous nature.
Are you someone in charge? I was told over the telephone that something has happened to Mr. Eastman and that I was to come down here immediately. I can't begin to tell you how completely inconvenient it was getting here. I was told I couldn't use the main entrance. I had to circle all the way around 104th
Terrible
and
actress.
backtrack on Figueroa. Would you mind telling me why?
Would you mind telling me why? By this time, Police Quest 3 writer Jane Jensen would have moved on to pen the cult classic Gabriel Knight, so the fan base was left to the limited skill of Dargan for better or worse. By the time SWAT 2 came around in 1998, the gaming space had changed greatly. FMV was out. Adventure games were dead. Gamers wanted action. Fast-paced, adrenaline-fueled, real-time combat. If we are looking at all the games in a vacuum, SWAT 2 is the most game-like among them. It combines real-time strategy with action gameplay while still retaining its procedural roots and offering a roguelike experience that changes every playthrough. It is brilliant in execution and a lot of fun to play, and much like SWAT 1, it would be lambasted by critics but sell 400,000 copies in 1 year. Much of this had to do with the controversy. Still bearing the Daryl Gates name, the studio decided to take real-life situations LAPD SWAT had lived through and put them into the game, including the LA riots caused by the beating of Rodney King. Overshadowed by insensitivity, this game would find its way into many hearts, but never enjoy the mainstream success that it deserved. It would go on to have 2 more sequels, both on the cutting edge like their progenitor. The series would morph into a tactical FPS, providing the framework and inspiration for later indie games like Bodycam. Imagine a world today where Ubisoft makes a procedural police game and, for marketing purposes, decides to pay Derek Chauvin to be on the box getting his input on modern policing. This is the decision that Ken Williams made, to associate his brand with the legacy of corrupt policing and brutality and it's hard to say from a strictly financial standpoint that it didn't work out for him. The worst part was, this image also got projected onto Jim Walz, who, by all reports, was a kind person and a good cop. In 2022, when he tried to make the game precinct, his efforts were stymied by a vocal minority hating him for actions he never even did. If you wear the badge, I guess you bring its history along with you. When I was a child, I was afforded the luxury of innocence to believe in the binary, cops and robbers, that there were those that sought to harm others and those that sought to protect them. That's the what of the situation. But the how and the why are the hard ones. Why do people run afoul of the law? Why can't we trust our institutions to protect the public? How do we stop this vicious cycle? Unfortunately, you're not going to find these answers in Police Quest, but at least you'll have a little fun.